Okay, we're setting up for the panel. Now, when I told y'all in the beginning that you were going to listen to some good talks, how'd that turn out for you? I've been in this movement for many, many years, since the late 1970s when I was a young lawyer practicing law in Laredo, in my hometown. And I can tell you I've listened to a lot of speeches, and during that period of time, these are three of the best talks I have ever heard. And so would you please thank them again.
You don't have a mic.
Okay, are we mic'd up?
Yeah, I think you're mic'd.
Glenn needs a mic.
That's not fair. We want fairness.
I think Glenn needs a mic.
Oh, okay.
Oh, you don't have a mic at all? Okay. All right, the way we're going to run it once Glenn gets a mic, is it's going to be a rather casual conversational type format rather than like a panel. So when I address a question, you guys, and these questions actually come from the participants. They submitted questions as part of the registration process, and so those are going to be the questions I address, but just feel free to interact in terms of if somebody wants to weigh in on an issue, feel free to do that. You want to test it?
Test 1, 2, 3. Is that working? Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
All right. I'm
All
ready
right,
to go.
here we go. The first two questions, I'm going to combine them, are from Colin Fields and Maddie Bratt. And Colin says, look, on this war on drugs, he has a hard time convincing Christians that drugs should be decriminalized. And he gets a lot of attacks when he starts to do that, saying, gosh, you want drugs to spread to everybody. And then Maddie Bratt says sort of the same thing. He or she says, hey, look, I get accused of being pro-drugs, and I'm a stoner and stuff when I call for drug legalization. And so what would you guys say about that? When you're advocating the legalization of drugs, how do you deal with those types of problems? Ron?
Well, the question comes up quite frequently. I remember in South Carolina it came up, and they were talking about legalizing drugs, and they said, you libertarians, you'd even legalize heroin. And I said, how many of you would take heroin tomorrow if it became legal? Nobody did. But this issue of religion and your beliefs, and I sort of touched on that, and that is who deals with risk and who makes the rules. And if you want to compare the danger of drugs, you have to start with prescription drugs. They're hundredfold more dangerous than the so-called illegal drugs. So you have to deal with that. But also, if you deal with a lot of killing, it's very often done in the name of religion. Now, I'm a believer. But one of the biggest enemies of mankind, I think, is theocracy, where they use this. So, but do we make religion illegal? What if you decide, well, there's a group out there and they do things and they're atheists? Well, we have to make that illegal and that sort of thing. No, I think that you cannot do it. The same freedom that you have to pick your religion, if your religion goes over the top and is used to kill people or steal from people and say that's a religious belief, that's the line. But your religions can be dangerous, and just think of ideas. How many people died in the 20th century because of collectivism? Hundreds of millions of people. So we don't outlaw ideas. So you don't do this. But to compare it to drugs and say it could be dangerous. You don't outlaw religion because they could be dangerous, and you don't outlaw drugs because the consequences, the practical results of the consequences are so much destruction of liberty. So I don't think that should be difficult, but it is challenging. People say this all the time, that, oh, I'm a Christian, I don't believe in it. Well, don't use them.
Jacob. Yeah, you know, there's several things that I find bizarre about that line of reasoning. I've always found it very strange when people say we need to criminalize drugs because drugs ruin people's lives, and they ruin the lives of their family members and a whole variety of other people. And I guess it can be true. It certainly is true that sometimes drug use does harm the individual and it can harm their family. But, you know, taking people who use drugs and putting them in the criminal court system and turning them into felons and then sticking them into a cage actually harms them a great deal as well. And so it's really weird, you know, to say, well, we're helping people, we're doing this out of concern for them, we want to prevent harm from them, being done to them, and our solution is to imprison them and take them away from their families. The other thing is there's an assumption embedded in that mindset that's really quite dubious that says that if we legalize drug usage, then it'll mean that fewer people do drugs. I think even if it meant that more people would do drugs, criminalization is still an evil. But there's lots of empirical evidence that calls that assumption into question. I actually did field research for the Cato Institute in 2008 and 2009 by going to Portugal, which was the first Western country to decriminalize all drugs, not just marijuana, but all drugs, including heroin, methamphetamines, cocaine. And in virtually every case, not just the social pathologies related to drugs, but drug usage itself decreased after Portugal implemented a system of decriminalization. And if you talk to the policymakers, what they actually say is that that was true for two reasons. One is that when you criminalize drug usage, you tell drug users, you have a reason to fear us, the state, with good reason. We'll put you into jail if we catch you. Which means that they run away from the state, they turn off from the state becomes their enemy. When you decriminalize, they become much more open to things like education campaigns about how to reduce the harms of drugs or the risk of drugs, or even to be persuaded not to use drugs in the first place. But the bigger reason is that if you don't use all your money paying prosecutors and police officers and prison guards to create this penal state of mass incarceration, you free up huge amounts of money that you can spend on much more constructive usages like drug counseling for people who want it, or methadone clinics, or all sorts of other ways to reduce the harms of drugs. And then finally, you know, I always just find it so bizarre. Obviously, alcohol, not just prescription drugs, but alcohol in excess causes enormous damage, yet no one thinks we should criminalize that, and for good reason, because we had this hideous experiment with prohibition where we learned that all of the harms from alcohol that were so upsetting, such as violence and gang warfare and the like, came not from alcohol but from prohibition itself, and that's obviously the same today.
As an atheist, it's probably dangerous for me to comment on religious dogma, but I would just say, you know, on the religious question, I mean, is there any, I mean, what's the virtue and righteousness if you never had the option to sin? You know, if the government takes all the sin away, I mean, isn't Christianity sort of about free will and sort of exercising your right to do or your ability to do the right thing? So, you know, that's I'll be the only one to address that for you.
All right, let's move to foreign policy for a minute. Al Swaim says, look, it seems that we have enough domestically to protect the United States against any attacks or invasions and so forth. If this is the case, why do we continue to spend billions of dollars to keep troops in the Middle East? And I would add to keep troops everywhere around the world. So Glenn, I'll start with you and we'll go from there.
Well, I mean, for one thing, there are a huge number of people who are making an enormous amount of money off of this just wildly excessive and aggressive and imperialistic foreign policy. And the people who are making the most money off that foreign policy are also the same people who wield the greatest power in Washington. And so I think it's really important, if you're ideological or political, you can dissect these policies and talk about why they're unjust and why they don't make sense, as we spend all day in doing. But as I'm sure Dr. Paul knows as well as anybody, you can win those arguments, but ultimately you have to win the game of power. And there's so many people with vested interest in making sure those policies continue. Then you have people who have all kinds of other agendas relating to foreign policy, whether it's securing access to the oil for American oil companies or perceived campaigns to protect foreign nations like Israel who want to stay in the Middle East and other places for all of those reasons as well. And then there's just the political imperative that it's so much easier to take the hawkish view and say we have to go kill the bad guys because that's a really easy case to manipulate the public into accepting than it is to have some courage and some conviction and to say, actually there's not that degree of moral clarity. It's not about good guys versus bad guys. It's actually about interest. And that's a much harder case to make, and therefore one politicians are much less inclined to make.
I think it's the way the... oh, go ahead. Yeah.
Thank you, Radley.
Didn't mean to step on your applause.
You almost stole my applause.
So, of course, the Department of Defense used to be called the Department of War, and then we decided we should go back to calling it, or start calling it the Department of Defense because it sounds better. But then, since World War II, every war we had fought up until September 11th weren't people who were attacking us. So then when people actually did attack us here at home, all of a sudden we're in this weird predicament where, well, wait a minute, the Department of Defense is out there waging sort of aggressive imperialist wars, but now we've been attacked on our home soil. Who do we have left to defend us here? So now we have to have a Department of Homeland Security to protect us in the way that the Department of Defense was supposed to be protecting us all along. You can just sort of see how the gradual mission creep, creates more bureaucracy, which then sort of justifies its own existence. And I mean, at some point, I think we're going to have, some sort of alternately worded federal agency that does the same thing that the Department of Homeland Security does now, given that DHS is they have a presence in foreign countries now. The Department of Homeland Security now has a presence in other countries. So at some point, we're going to have another agency to do what they're supposed to be doing now.
Right?
I think Glenn hit the nail on the head. It has a lot to do with money. But I think that is one element that promotes the war, but how do they get the crowd to get along with it? And it has to be, mob psychology. They have to feel good about the war, and it's usually, something very holy, and churches get behind the wars and distort things, and it's the church of the government, the patriotism. I had been accused so often in Washington that I was unpatriotic and I didn't care about the troops. So you have to be patriotic and support the troops. When they did that, I usually had a fairly good comeback. I said, well, if that's true that I don't support the troops, why do they send me the most money? They don't want to fight those wars either.
Can I just add one thing to that? It is so true that, I think one of the most effective things we can do, along the lines of what Dr. Paul was just saying, is just challenge so aggressively the propaganda that enables our fellow citizens to accept these wars that are so plainly not in their interest. And usually the propaganda is so transparently ridiculous. And I'll just give you one quick example that I found amazing. And I was telling Dr. Paul about this earlier today. Jeb Bush went onto Twitter this morning with the purpose of criticizing President Obama for doing two of the only good things that he's done in the last 6 years, which is establish better relations with Cuba and also try and negotiate an arms deal with Iran, as Dr. Paul said earlier, to make sure peace can break out. And this was his argument, Jeb Bush's, for why President Obama shouldn't be doing that. He said, we shouldn't be legitimizing brutal dictators. And my question that I had for Jeb Bush, which I actually asked him, and I'm still waiting for an answer, and I'm hoping to get one, is how much time have you and your family spent with Saudi monarchs? And it is. It's amazing that we hear so much that the U.S. is devoted to freedom and we hate tyrants, and our greatest friends in the world, the people with whom we work most closely, are basically the most repressive regimes in that
But
region.
I mean, some of the propaganda works. Some of it works, though. I mean, the tactic that always gets me, and I'm as anti-war as probably anyone in this room, but this new thing where at sporting events they'll have this little halftime ceremony where they bring one of the troops home and then they unite them with their family who doesn't know that this is happening. Or the other one is they'll unite them with their dog, which always gets me and probably gets Glenn too. And we should sort of be upset that the government has taken this person away from their family and away from their dog and sent them overseas and put their life at risk. Instead, it's set up in this way that sort of makes us happy and joyous and to see this happening and we sort of then get very sort of warm and mushy about the military itself, and there's this kind of complete disconnect, but it's warped in a way. I mean, it's sort of similar to what I talked about in my speech about Corey May's homecoming, where we were all joyous and happy when we should have been kind of angry about all of this. But I just so many times I've watched those reunions and I've like gotten a little choked up, and then I would think, wow, I was just manipulated.
All right. Well, okay, you guys have raised the concept of patriotism. And what I found very interesting in this whole thing since 9/11 is this dichotomy of who's the patriot? Because you see this whole group of people on the side of the national security state condemning people like Edward Snowden, condemning people like yourself, Glenn, and Ron, saying you hate the government, you hate America, you see?
He loves the terrorists.
Yeah, terrorists. And so where do you draw the line as to who's the patriot in this battle and who's the traitor?
Maybe we should just go back to the origination of our country. Who were the patriots then? They were the ones that took on the government. They didn't like what the government was doing. Those are the patriots. This guy here, every one of them, and certainly Edward.
Yeah, I mean, to me, you can obviously, if you want, define patriotism as the extent to which you're loyal of and defending of the government. If that's really the warped, really like manipulative and dangerous definition of patriotism that you want to adopt. And we recently saw that, this actually amazed me when Tom Cotton and the other Senate Republicans sent a letter to the Iranian mullahs warning them that they could undo the deal. I found that repellent, and I thought it was clearly designed to undercut the negotiations. But what I found even more repellent, actually, was that there were a lot of Democrats, like in the media and political establishment, who literally started calling that treason. And even signing petitions saying that all 47 of the U.S. senators who signed that letter ought to be arrested for violations of the Logan Act or even for being traitors. And they were serious because their argument was, well, look, they undermined the will and the agenda of the leader of the country, the commander-in-chief. And this is a mentality that really has seeped into both parties, that patriotism is defined not the way it should be defined, which is a defense of the values and freedoms that are supposed to define our country, but instead your fealty to political leaders, and down that road lies pure authoritarianism.
Like most great quotes, it's probably apocryphal, but I seem to remember a Mark Twain quote about patriotism, which was that I love my country, I mistrust my government, which I think is a good definition of patriotism.
Michael Lamore asked what may be the most profound question in all the questions we received. And it really is addressed to all three of you. He says, how did you become such a badass? And look, I mean, what he's really referring to, you guys take a lot of flack for what you've done. You've taken positions that are outside the mainstream. You get condemned, you get attacked. What is it that motivates you to do what you're doing in your life?
Well, I'm sure it has crossed the minds of all of us here, and I certainly see it in these two gentlemen. I see it in Edward Snowden, and I think that is seeking truth. And that's where the problem is. You just can't believe the government, and people want to know the truth, and they can accept the truth if they hear it, but they don't hear it from the politicians. The politicians tell the lies that they think the people want to hear. But if it was absolutely impossible to try to stick to the truth all the time, and it was a total political failure, I wouldn't have been elected, 12 times. People who know you and understand you, I mean, there was the large majority of people in our district was not for the war. And I had a lot of friends call, but the greatest calls came about 2 years later. And they said, Ron, I'm sorry, but you're right on this, about the war. So I think it's a starvation for truth. And if you're confident about it, and that's why I emphasize trying to learn the truth. I don't think anybody has a automatic monopoly over the truth. And I think we should keep working on that. And I think it's always important also on the presentation. I was, as bad as it might have seemed for me to be up there among that group, actually on a personal basis, I thought the personal fights were irrelevant. I was dealing with another issue outside of Washington, trying to get people to understand what liberty was all about. And I think the seeking of truth sort of settled me. So I never lost any sleep over the grief that they tried to give me.
What about you, Glenn?
Yeah, I think answering a question like that requires you a little bit to kind of lay on the couch and be a little like self-therapeutic, and I'll spare you all that. But I do think that sometimes how you approach political questions is a byproduct of your own personal experiences, and we probably all have that moment in life where institutions of authority or orthodoxies that we're taught to accept suddenly become kind of lacking in credibility to us for whatever reasons, and it's a really healthy experience to have, to start to say, well, instead of just kind of mentally and intellectually submitting to what I'm told I should think, I'm actually going to start evaluating the people who are issuing these decrees for their appropriateness in issuing them. And a lot of times once you start doing that, you start to realize actually the people who are purporting to be able to decree what conventional wisdom is or what you're supposed to think are actually people who you want to be as far away from as possible. And, it's like, if I wake up and I see that, Bill Kristol has said that, I'm a subversive who loves the terrorists, my reaction is, of course you don't like to be called names, but ultimately my reaction is like, thank God he hates me, I'd be horrified if he didn't. And I think it's important, if you want to get yourself to withstand that kind of criticism, it's important to think about who's actually launching it and what it says about you that they are. And then the other thing I think is really important, I talked about this a little at the end, but I just want to emphasize it one more time because it is a big motivator for me. When I started writing about politics, a lot of it was sort of abstract. I was approaching it like a constitutional lawyer, and these executive power theories about what the president was permitted to do offended my sense of intellect and my kind of abstract political views about what America is and what the Constitution is, and you can't punish people without due process. And then in the course of doing that work, I started actually interacting with a lot of the people who were personally victimized by these policies. You go into Muslim American communities in the United States and you listen to young, 19-year-old Somali Americans who should be loving the country and looking forward to an opportunity, and instead they're talking about what it's like to have their phones tapped and their right to travel arbitrarily denied, or you talk to parents of kids who have been targeted with entrapment campaigns where they're turned into terrorists for the slightest provocation when they wouldn't have harmed anybody, or you go into African American communities and you see the devastation of police brutality or mass incarceration. And I think it's so important to just make sure that empathy for fellow human beings always stays as the motivator. I mean, if you look at the work that Radley did on the Corey May case, there's just no question, and I don't want to talk for him, but it's always been my impression that he wasn't driven by, statistics about mass incarceration. He was driven by the horror of the injustice of being done to his fellow citizen, this other human being. And that is, I think, the most passionate and the purest motivator you can have in politics, is to always keep in mind what the effect is of these policies on other people.
Yeah, so Glenn much more eloquently and flatteringly put what I was going to say, which was I would just get pissed off. I remember working at Cato, and I would sit sort of in my office, and I would read about these cases and these, raids gone wrong. I remember actually talking to the mother of Sal Colosi, this 38-year-old optometrist in Fairfax, Virginia, who was basically murdered in his own home because he was wagering on college football games. An undercover cop had overheard him and befriended him and started wagering with him and upping the ante until Sal wagered enough to trip the state statute for running a gambling operation. And they responded by sending a SWAT team. And when he reached into his pocket to get out his cell phone because he thought he was meeting a friend who he owed some money to, one of the officers mistook it for a gun and shot him straight in the heart and killed him. And I remember you talk to his parents, and I remember talking to his mother, and she would sort of look at me and say, "Oh, you're a big boy just like my Sal," and like you talk to these people, and it just angers you. And that's really, that is the motivation. When people, when you get, every now and then you get a little victory. Corey's case is a big victory, but also, a policy change here or there. New Mexico just abolished civil asset forfeiture, the first state. Yeah. The ACLU and the Institute for Justice were the driving forces behind that. Those are two organizations that lose far, far, far more often than they win. But you do get that sort of sense of justice and accomplishment every now and then. But I think it's empathy, and it's just getting angry when somebody screws somebody else over just because they have a little more power than they do.
I have a quick question for the two of you. Do you get the same type of nonsense from the media that a person in politics does? Do you have to put up with this? You've both been interviewed in that, because I'm a lot less tolerant of that than I am with my colleagues, because I can seem to get past that, and it's not like this. But when it comes to the media, but you receive that too? I see you as academics, and that you would maybe get it less than a politician.
I gotta say, actually, I get treated pretty well by the media. It may be because I'm a journalist or sort of self-identify as a journalist, but there are some kind of fringe groups on either side that have attacked me. I've been accused of being both a bleeding heart liberal and a radical right-winger. But sort of the mainstream media, and they've been, I think it helps that I cover issues that nobody's really in favor of wrongful convictions. Nobody's in favor of dogs getting shot in drug raids. So I can't really. Glenn's taken a lot of heat from fellow journalists, unjustly, I think. So.
Yeah, I was going to say I haven't been treated quite as well. But
well, Glenn, that's because you're not really a journalist.
Exactly, an activist. I kind of got asked on Meet the Press by the host if I belonged in prison for the reporting I was doing and things like that. But, what I actually think that reveals is, the work I do tends to be very kind of adversarial to those who wield political power. And so there's a lot of debate all the time about what the media bias is. And if you talk to conservatives, they'll tell you all day and night that the media has a liberal bias. But if you talk to liberals, they'll tell you, no, actually the media has a conservative bias. And they'll point to pretty good examples, like the media pretty much marching lockstep behind most of the post-9/11 Bush policies, especially the Iraq War. The New York Times and Tom Friedman and people like that did more, Jeffrey Goldberg did more to persuade Americans than anybody. And I think that's because the real bias of the media is that they're just subservient to power. Sometimes Democrats wield power and sometimes Republicans wield power, and whoever wields power at the moment is the one the media is on its knees for. And so if you're somebody who wants to work against that power, the media is going to view you through the lens of their masters, which are the people who own and run D.C. And so, they'll be pretty hostile towards you.
I remember when California was first, the ballot initiative to legalize pot in California first came up, before Washington and Colorado. Matt Welch, the editor of Reason magazine, was keeping track of the editorials of the largest newspapers in the state. I can't remember what the final tally was, but I remember at some point it was like 27 of the largest 28 newspapers in California had written a staff editorial against legalizing marijuana. So I think Glenn's exactly right. I mean, the media's statist. It's not liberal. It's not conservative. They support power.
Well, and when you look historically, the great achievements for liberty have always been by a very tiny minority of people, and those minority have usually been the badasses. I mean, there's that guy in the colonial era that was fighting for trial by jury, that the jury was the final decider of the guilt or innocence of a person, and he just refused to come in with a guilty verdict. And they were telling him, you have to come in with a guilty verdict. He says, no, we're not going to do it. And they jailed him and all this, and we end up with trial by jury because of one guy. I mean, it shows you what you can do. We have a little bit of time. Well, we're a little bit over time, but if you don't mind, I'd like to go a little bit over, because this is a really good question. The Raksha Misha, and I'll start with you, Radley, asks, what extent do you think the war on drugs, and I'll add the war on terrorism, has changed the United States?
Oh, man. I mean, the war on drugs, I think it is the single most destructive domestic policy since Jim Crow. I mean, it infects every... it infects every single layer of government. I mean, it certainly infects our foreign policy, but I mean, there are so many ways that the ONDCP, the Office of National Drug Control Policy, by law, by federal law, the ONDCP is not allowed to talk about any possible benefits to medical marijuana. By law. Basically, the ONDCP chief, the drug czar, is required by federal law to lie about marijuana. I mean, that's absurd. I mean, it's not, and they don't even try to hide it. I mean, it's right there in the federal code. So, I mean, I think the drug war has been destructive. Constitutional scholars regularly refer to the drug war exception to the Fourth Amendment. I think James Bovard has over the years, done a great job of talking about just some of the absurdities that you can point to. For example, in airports, when you're getting off an airplane, the Supreme Court or federal appeals courts together have ruled that customs aid officials can detain you on the slightest suspicion if you are the first person off a plane, because that means you're trying to quickly get to your destination to make some sort of drug deal, I guess. If you're the last person off a plane, because you're trying to avoid suspicion, but also if you're conspicuously in the middle of people exiting the plane. In the 1980s, the Supreme Court actually ruled that customs officials can detain you without a warrant, can bring you into a room, give you a trash can, and observe you until you defecate in front of them, because that's how serious we want to be about people importing drugs, in this case by swallowing balloons. I mean, that is absurd. I mean, if you could go back and sort of interview what the founders were thinking when they crafted the Fourth Amendment, what James Madison in particular was thinking, and you said, let me give you a hypothetical, right? You want people to be able to have some privacy. How about, let's say the government wants to detain you in a room without telling anyone, without letting you contact an attorney, without a warrant, and watch you until you defecate. Is that something that you think maybe the Fourth Amendment should protect against? I mean, we've come so far, from that original vision. I think we've lost, almost everything. I mean, we certainly lost our sort of moral authority on these kinds of issues, our ability to sort of, tell other countries why privacy is important, why being free from government searches and government suspicion or government actions due to mere suspicion is important. I think it's hard to sort of, it's hard to find, I mean, I'm a journalist, you'd think I could find words for things, but it's hard to sort of express, I think, just how radically the drug war has changed us. Glenn?
Yeah, I think I tried to get a little revenge stealing your puzzle. I think there's a really good reason why this is called a war, why Washington loves to call things wars on terror, the war on drugs. I mean, that's because in war, that's when the power of political officials is at its highest. And that's been true forever. Like Cicero said during the Roman Empire, when men pick up arms, the law falls mute. Like, there are no legal constraints on what people who wield political power can do in times of war, more or less. And so, yeah, of course, there have been all kinds of obvious policy erosions of rights over the last 30 years in the name of both of these wars. I mean, I remember what got me writing about politics and leaving the law was when I watched the case of Jose Padilla, who was an American citizen who was arrested at Chicago O'Hare International Airport and accused by a hastily called press conference with John Ashcroft of being the dirty bomber. He wanted to detonate a radioactive weapon, a radiological bomb in the United States. And rather than trying him in a court, he was literally transferred to a military brig in South Carolina, where he remained for the next 3.5 years in solitary confinement, denied all access to communication with anyone in the outside world, including a lawyer. That was an American citizen arrested on U.S. soil and imprisoned for years with no charges. And I remember the reason why I left law and started writing about politics because I watched that happen and watched nobody object and thought, you know, if we're willing to allow the government to do that, what aren't we willing to allow the government to do? And then, you know, just a few years later when the presidency switched, I got my answer, which is when the Obama administration declared that it had the right not only to arrest American citizens and imprison them without charges, but literally to target them with execution by drone with no charges of any kind. And that created very little controversy as well. So, you know, and you can spend all day going through examples of things that are literally the living, breathing antithesis of what the Constitution was supposed to guarantee, including the idea of mass surveillance. I mean, general warrants issued by the British King, the idea that you could just have whole community searched, was one of the central grievances of the founders. But beyond the policy issues, I think that war actually degrades the culture and mentality of the population that wages it, especially when the war becomes endless. Because what wars require in order for the population to be willing in good conscience to allow them is constant demonization of other groups of people. This group of individuals is so menacing, so toxic, so evil that you need to empower us to destroy them. And not just to destroy them, but to use any and all means. Invasions, aggression, torture, drones, due process-free imprisonment, mass surveillance, this all becomes justified simply by a sustained campaign of demonization. And I think when you're training and indoctrinating an entire population, not for a year or two, but endlessly, to hate certain groups so much that you want to see them obliterated by any means necessary, that really degrades the population, the fabric of the political and national culture in really odious ways. And I think that more than even the policy incursions is what I think the cost has been.
I certainly agree with both of your assessments and how serious it is and how bad it's been for our country. I do think it's worthwhile thinking about it, though, as part of a bigger picture of an attack on liberty per se, because that is a bigger picture. It involves economics, you can get involved with foreign policy and everything else. But the damage done by, you know, the war on drugs is very obvious. As a matter of fact, it'll serve as a benefit because it'll be the motivation to do something about it. But I think the big picture is important too. I think in order to get this reversed, we have to understand who are the lobbyists. Well, there's somebody, you have Christian churches lobbying against it. You have alcohol companies, they don't want it legalized. You have drug companies, they like to sell Valium. And so there's a lot of special interests. Drug dealers sort of like the war in drug, keep it illegal. So those interests are very important. But I have said over the years, and I'm still optimistic about it, that this country will wake up, and I think it's starting to wake up like they did about prohibition. It was so obvious and so stupid and so bad that people woke up. But you know, they lived in different times. They actually thought they had to amend the Constitution to make it illegal. Now we're in a bigger mess because there's no respect for that. You just can't, you know, repeal an amendment. So it's a lot different. But I think the people are waking up. But since it wasn't precise, the right wasn't precisely given, or the authority to the government, how's it going to happen? I think it's going to be nullification. I think in the states have already done it. And they're winning some of these fights. I think that's all very, very healthy. But someday, especially in the midst of a major crisis, this won't be the most important issue. They're going to be worrying about where they're going to get the food and when the troops are coming home. But I think it will end, and I think the stage is set. And I think a lot will happen when the federal government is flat out broke. The states will lose their efficiency. The responsibility will be on us. But to me, the most important issue is the dealing with risk is a personal matter, and it's a lot bigger than just whether or not you smoke marijuana. I think it's much bigger in everything that we do, and we need the government out of our lives.
All right, we're going to wrap it up with one last question, but it's actually going to be three people asking the same question, but pretty much the same thing. It's Victor Benavides says, besides voting and activism, how can everyday Americans do their part to ensure that liberty is preserved and defended for future generations? Diana Anderson says, since there are so many things a person can do to help change these issues, name the one most effective thing a person can do to work toward change. And Grace Kirkland says, the American people seem to be waking up, but Congress does not. How do we get them to stop supporting the pointless wars? And I think that I want to encapsulate this in one question is, what can people in the audience do? What would you say they can do to bring this country back on the right track again? And start with you, Radley, and move around.
So I'm just going to talk about the issues that sort of I cover specifically because I do think there are a couple of very simple things people can do. Most of the issues that I cover on policing, I mean the drug war is obviously a much bigger issue, but in terms of policing, in terms of how police are used, police tactics, and also in terms of prosecutorial misconduct and prosecutorial abuse, these are all local issues that are generally decided locally. It is really, really easy to influence a local election. Nobody really pays attention to district attorneys' races. Very few people, I mean, most people who vote them in those races are people who went to the polls to vote for somebody else and just happen to be down the ticket. It's really easy to influence those races. And I'll give you an example. The Center for Public Integrity just put out a report a couple weeks ago, about this group. I can't remember their name, but this very sort of far-right law and order group. And this group has been able to defeat judges and city council people, local officials across the country just by coming in and buying like one or two commercials or a couple newspaper ads describing these people as, soft on crime. I know one particular judge actually on the Mississippi Supreme Court who was actually the only judge in the Mississippi Supreme Court who was voting the right way on this forensic scandal that I've been reporting on for about 10 years. And he was beaten because these guys came in and they called him a defender of child murderers. And actually one of the cases they mentioned, that case is actually about to be overturned. The conviction's about to be overturned. But the fact that this group can come in with very, very little money and alter these races, to me suggests that another group could come in, a more forward-thinking group, and alter these races as well. I mean, there are super PACs for every possible issue you can possibly imagine. There's no super PAC for civil liberties. Like nobody's targeting district attorneys who abuse their power or sheriffs who abuse their power. And those races are very, very easy to influence. It wouldn't take a whole lot of money. It wouldn't even take a whole lot of activism. It happened successfully, I think, in the right way in Brooklyn, where the longtime 30-year prosecutor who nobody even ran against because everybody just assumed his re-election was a foregone conclusion. A few people got together and decided this guy's abusive. He's put innocent people in prison. They got him beat, and the new prosecutor who's taken over since is now undoing the 30 years of damage that his predecessor did. It's a case in Colorado. There are two judges who, when they were prosecutors, withheld exculpatory evidence in the conviction of a guy named Tim Masters, who was released after 20 years. They were judges by the time the courts found out that they had withheld this evidence and this guy was released. A few activists got together. They were up for retention. Colorado's they don't have judge elections, but you vote on whether the judge should be retained. And they put together a very sort of bare bones campaign to get these judges kicked out of office, and it worked. I mean, so on the very local level, on a lot of these criminal justice issues, it would be very, very easy to have some influence. Wouldn't even take money really. I mean, just take some activism, getting the word out. People vote for the DA because they've always voted for the same DA, or they vote for the sheriff because they've always voted for the same sheriff. If you give them a reason not to vote for someone, it isn't hard to convince them. So that's what I would say, at least at the local level.
Yeah, I'm glad. Thank you to the three of you who asked that, because I do think there's always a danger at places like this where you can gather and talk about all these hideous policies and these heinous outcomes. that you can kind of, inadvertently spread this gloominess, like, God, I just listened to hours of all these things going wrong. I think I want to go crawl into my bed and, jump off a bridge or whatever. So it is important to realize that, and I talked about this a little bit earlier, that this defeatism that might be tempting sometimes actually should be really unpersuasive. There are all kinds of things that you can do that isn't just about sitting around and analyzing these issues, but actually doing something about them. And I'll just give you an example in the context of the work I've been doing, for the past couple of years on mass surveillance. Sometimes when I go to do interviews, people say, well, look, Edward Snowden unraveled his life to expose the system of mass surveillance, and you've done all this work, and other journalists have done all this work, and yet, nothing has changed. I mean, Congress hasn't even passed a bill to restrict it. And I always kind of laugh at that, at the idea that the way that the power of the U.S. government is going to be reined in is by some institution in the U.S. government called the Congress reining it in, because people just don't walk around thinking about how to restrict their own power. And even if they did pass a bill, it would be written by like Dianne Feinstein and Saxby Chambliss or whoever, and it would be all empty and vapid and symbolic, and it would be called as pretty words of reform, but it would really be designed to protect the system. And the intelligence community, even if you did pass a real law, are experts at co-opting and capturing the process and rendering it impotent. So I never cared or much about whether there was a bill passed, but there have been huge changes that have been real impediments to mass surveillance that have mostly taken place just through the actions of individuals. Things like refusing to use Facebook and Google and Yahoo and Microsoft as long as they continue to be collaborators with the NSA has scared the crap out of those companies because they think that they're going to lose the next generation of users or the next generation after that to Korean and German and Brazilian social media companies that say don't use their services because they'll give your data to the US government, use ours and we'll protect your privacy. And so because of this consumer demand, these companies are now embedding into the latest iPhone or the latest releases genuinely impenetrable encryption systems that prevent them, even if the government demands it, from invading the privacy of their users. And it has really scared the US and British governments that there is now a serious electronic wall between them, their prying eyes and what people on the internet are doing. Or people just on their own using encryption or using browsers that let you remain anonymous have really made mass surveillance much more difficult, and those are way more effective changes than any bill that Dianne Feinstein might endorse. And so, those kind of changes are always really significant. And I just want to say a couple other things about that. One is, sometimes people will say, we're sitting around talking a lot about issues, but we're not really doing anything about them. There's this distinction between talking and doing. And I think this distinction is really quite illusory. Don't underestimate the power of reason and the power of information and what it means when you try and persuade other people to think certain things or to be aware of certain things. It really has spawned all kinds of fundamental change throughout history more than anything else. If you go to a place like this and get information and communicate information with other people, you're already doing something quite powerful. And one of the biggest causes for optimism, I think, is that the internet, has been this promised technology for so many years. It's finally fulfilling its promise where if you want to reach large groups of people, you no longer need to go to work for NBC News or apply to the New York Times or the Washington Post and accept all the constrictions and rules that come with working there. You can go online and just communicate directly with all kinds of people. You curate your own news for your friends. Be the kind of person who's just really assertive and even annoying about disseminating information. You don't need large media outlets to do it. The internet has really given you that power in your own hands, and you should use it. And the last thing I want to say is, and I touched on this a little bit earlier about working with Edward Snowden, and I was saying this a little bit at the end, but I just want to elaborate a small amount. You don't have to be one of the people who is the extreme example, risking arrest and fire hosing in order to defend the civil rights movement or setting yourself on fire. Don't do that. Even though it contributed to the Arab Spring, or unraveling your life and subjecting yourself to felony charges the way Edward Snowden did. Especially if you're young, you're in college, but even if you're a working professional, you have choices that you have to make every single day about what your values are and what role you want to play in the world. And if you get out of college with a bunch of computer expertise, you're going to have on the one hand companies and corporations that are offering to pay you a lot of money, like Palantir and others who work directly with the CIA and the NSA, and they'll want to recruit you to go use your skills and your resources to promote all these policies and to promote the national security state. Or on the other hand, you can take less money and go to work for the ACLU or hacker groups that are developing privacy technology. We all have these choices every single day in our lives that actually do determine the impact that we have on the world. And I just think it's really important that you never minimize the power that you have to affect the world that you live in. And all of those choices ultimately are byproducts of the kind of function and role that you want to play as a human being.
In many ways, I touched on this in my talk about what I think we should do, and to me, the most important thing is self-education, and that's available to us today like it's never been available before. Before, it used to be 90% or more all got everything from the establishment, whether it's the government or the news media or our government schools, and that's old-fashioned now. So it's available. But if you're seeking the answer in less government and more liberty, this is very precise, and I think understanding is one thing. You read it and you agree with it, but if you want to have an impact, you have to be able to take those ideas, which are very challenging, both to conservatives and liberals, to present this in a very positive way that it's a benefit. So that is, if you believe in this, it would be back to the drug laws. You know, be able to explain why these drug laws are bad, and they can understand this for them to go along with it, and that you cannot have a system where you allow the government to assume the role of protecting us from ourselves. That's very important, because then they can protect us for all kinds of reasons, spiritual, intellectual, and physical, and drugs, and everything. They cannot protect us from ourselves, and we should be able to defend that. But the same way in economics is if liberty is to produce a better society, we have to realize that liberty means that it applies in economic policy too, because all of a sudden if you say, well, no, that's where we need government force because we don't want anybody to fall through the cracks, and that's a cave-in, because the system we have is terrible for the poor. They're always falling through the cracks. The rich get bailed out, the poor lose their job, they lose their mortgages, and the entitlement system is evil. And guess who runs it? The very wealthy. They make the money, and they get the bailouts, and we have to be able to produce, argue that case so you have a populist appeal, which will appeal to liberals as well as conservatives and libertarians. But believe me, the bottom line for me is that if you understand liberty, you're going to have less war, you're going to have a lot more prosperity, and we won't have a war on drugs because everybody will be making up their own minds about the drugs.
That concludes our program. I just would reinforce what our three speakers have said about where we are as a society. We keep in mind that we once lived in a country, Americans lived in a country where there was no war on drugs, where there was no national security state, foreign interventionism and the like. And things changed. And they changed because of the power of bad ideas. Because bad ideas can be just as powerful as good ideas. But that should give us reason for optimism, because if the country can shift in a bad direction, it can also shift back into a good direction. And that means the ending, not the reforming of things like the drug war and the war on terrorism, the national security state, and so forth. I share what Glenn said, is that there's a power that comes about from meetings like this. Power of ideas, the power of reason, power of discussion. There's a reason why totalitarian dictatorships shut meetings like this down. They know there's a power here. It transforms the way you're thinking. You share an idea with somebody else, different perspective with somebody else, and all of a sudden there's a rippling out effect. And there's an old saying that as much as you learn, and that's important, as Ron says, self-education, but there's an old saying that nobody nobody cares about what you know until they know that you care. And that's exemplified by Radley's defense of Corey May. I mean, he didn't do it, as Glenn pointed out, because of statistics or because of studies or cost-benefit analysis. It's because he cared about this one human being and his family. And that can do more than to change the course of a society than all the statistics in the world. And I share what Ron said about we have to be the model for the world. The world is mired in statism. And I don't think there's any hope that any country in the world is going to change things except this country. And that if we can establish the free society, the model society, the society that dismantles, doesn't reform things like the war on drugs and the war on terrorism and the whole warfare state, then we, the American people, lead the world out of this status morass, and we lead the world to the highest reaches of freedom that mankind has ever seen. So thank you very much for coming to the conference and participating.